this distinction, then it is quite accurate for us, particularly on the GCC region, taking into account the big difference that you shared with us that assure ourselves between a political economy and the investment returns that are really behind the figures of sovereign wealth funds. So what will be, based on your perspective, the outlook for the upcoming commodity versus non-commodity sovereign wealth funds in the MENA region? How do you think the region should focus more, taking into account the way in which the market, the sector is reconfiguring in the coming years?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Maybe just one point on the previous question that maybe should have added is, for all of the excitement about countries like, let's just take India for example. Yeah, this is a very exciting destination for investments. There's a lot of potential there. There's going to be a lot of growth. It's going to be the largest country as per population in the world, if not now, very soon. But then we also see examples of major companies like Adani just having a lot of trouble. I mean, they're being not necessarily the same safeguards and the same access to information and transparency that you might that some investors might come to expect and and really require to underpin their investments. So again, like just gets back to that risk reward equation and the tolerance that investors have. These markets for all of their potential still have a lot of work to do to kind of to assuage investor concerns and to make sure that that investors don't get themselves into international investors don't get themselves into to really hot water and feel like they got burned and then kind of look elsewhere. Anyway, let's go back to the kind of the broader outlook. We're talking about commodity-based funds, I guess, versus non-commodity-based funds. I mean, I think I tend to spend most of my time thinking about the sovereign wealth funds in countries that are primarily, oil and gas exporters. And no matter how you really want to think about the sovereign wealth funds and the financialized assets that they have, these funds in countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, in most of the funds in the UAE and other countries, Kuwait, Qatar. I mean, these funds are, to be very honest, these are primarily built with the proceeds from hydrocarbon exports. I mean, they're financialized, sure. And I guess the big question is always looking forward, what these sovereign wealth funds will do with their assets. But I think we do have to remember at the end of the day that this is the continued influx of sovereign wealth, especially in the cash that they have. There are other ways to kind of take on debt and asset transfers from the government. There are other ways to grow assets of the sovereign wealth fund, which I would argue are not do not reflect genuine growth of sovereign wealth portfolio, but rather kind of moving around government assets from one place to the other. I think if you want to just talk about what reflects organic growth of sovereign wealth, well, it's really return on your investments, realized return on your investments, and then the influxes of capital you're getting, whether it's royalties and fees from hydrocarbon exports, or it's transfers to the government that's become institutionalized, like you might see in a place in Kuwait, or that's a little bit more ad hoc, like you would see in Saudi Arabia. That's actual hard capital, investment capital, that you could point to say that this is evidence of a growing fund. And I think the reality is at the end of the day, the size and the weight and the significance of these sovereign wealth funds is still largely correlated to oil and gas resources on one level, and then the ability for these countries, oil exporting countries, to ensure high enough prices where they're still realizing budget surpluses that then can trickle over into the central bank and or to sovereign wealth funds. So it's kind of a twofold. It's a twofold process there. I think that it looks like based on energy, I'm speaking just about, of course, hydrocarbon commodities, but looking at forecasts for oil and gas prices for at least the next couple of years, I think that the sovereign wealth funds that are in oil and gas producing countries, these are going to be in the strongest positions. There's no question about it. They're still going to realize these countries are going to realize decent surpluses this year, probably not as good as last year in 2022, but quite a bit of that, of those surpluses will make their way back into sovereign wealth funds. I think that we have to be realistic over the long run about how likely it is for sovereign wealth funds to transform into a fully sustainable funding mechanism for these countries. And one example that I like to bring up is Norway's sovereign wealth fund. This is one of the largest in the world, depending on what you consider a sovereign wealth fund. If you want to bring in maybe some Chinese entities that might be knocked off the top list, but let's just say, for all intents and purposes, the largest, most professionalized sovereign wealth fund at about $1.4 trillion, if my estimates are correct. That's about double the size of Kuwait's sovereign wealth fund, more than double the size of the public investment fund. But Norway's sovereign wealth fund only contributes about 25% to the country's budget. So that's like a professionalized, sustainable sovereign wealth fund approach with one of the largest sovereign wealth, if not the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, is still only going to give a small country like Norway 25% of public sector revenues. So what that tells me is, even if the sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East continue to grow and grow at a very healthy clip and tremendously, double in size over the next decade or so, there's still going to need to be more dynamism to these countries' public sector reform efforts and their fiscal consolidation and fiscal discipline, because sovereign wealth alone, even in the biggest, most professionally run funds, is not going to be sufficient to power these countries' governments and their economies. It'll be an important segment, but it won't be sufficient in and of itself.
I think precisely following your most recent statement, it will be interesting also to take a closer look at non-commodity specialized wealth funds. The same rankings provide perhaps the information that China may be the largest one on the planet. How do you think this geopolitical contest between China and the US will impact the MENA region sovereign wealth funds strategy, since especially the MENA region is operating in the fault lines, the Sino-US economic and political conflict zone? How do you think such context will fuel potential regulatory regime wars in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, and thank you for reminding me about the second part of the last question about the kind of non-hydrocarbon commodity-based funds, and the Chinese sovereign wealth funds are a good example of that. And really, that's part and parcel why I thought it would be so interesting to bring in Asian case studies alongside Middle Eastern case studies, because you have some of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds, but if you dig down to the source, the origin of the investment capital in these funds, you see a very different model that allowed those sovereign wealth funds to grow. One, I mean, largely from very lucrative trade exports, but one coming obviously from hydrocarbons, and in another instance with China, you have year-on-year trade surpluses with partners around the globe, and those trade surpluses are, they're depositing those surpluses into sovereign wealth funds. So it's interesting to look at those two different models, and then to actually see where there are examples of intersectionality, where sovereign wealth funds are collaborating. And this is part and parcel what I've tasked my colleagues with, who are contributing chapters to dig up this really interesting and intriguing information. But to your point about the geopolitical contest between China and the U.S. and how that impacts, Middle East sovereign wealth funds, it's a good question. I mean, just when we think that things were maybe headed in a more positive direction for U.S.-China relations, maybe an easing of tensions, we had what seemed like a new round of developments that kind of resulted in official trips being canceled and a heightening of tensions. And just, I think the Economist last week published their recent weekly edition of the magazine that said things are worse than they've ever been. So, the rhetoric is kind of ramping up. There is this sense that, oh no, things are so bad. But I guess if we step back and you look at what U.S. officials actually say about how their allies in the Middle East engage with China, whether this is on the domain of sovereign wealth fund investments or collaboration or otherwise, generally speaking, economic engagement doesn't fall into the very controversial category of ties and relations. And this should be obvious, and it's also logical because my country, the United States, has, if you look at the numbers, a very robust economic relationship with China. There are a lot of U.S. very profitable U.S. companies that rely on supply chains in China, to this day, and have not necessarily found better alternatives, even if they wanted to. So I think the reality is, and this is acknowledged by U.S. officials, is that most economic engagement between entities in the Middle East and Chinese counterparts is expected and permissible and doesn't fall into that controversial bucket, so to speak. And I think sovereign wealth funds fall into that category. I've been following this issue. I don't think that when a sovereign wealth fund official from the UAE, for example, from Mubadala, comes to the US and talks, or any other sovereign wealth fund, and if you hear them say, oh, we're looking to diversify our portfolio and allocate a bit more capital into Asian markets, China, India, and others, that doesn't really throw people, at least the important folks here in Washington, into a tizzy. I just don't think that is really something that government officials in the U.S. are seriously concerned about. So I would say that a lot of times there is this sense that any kind of engagement can get sucked into the black hole that is, U.S. China competition on a global stage. But the reality is, the sovereign wealth funds, I mean, they can make a very compelling case that they need to have a diversified portfolio. And in one way, in another way, this actually plays into the kind of broader foreign policy picture that seems to be emerging within the region. And what we see, or at least the view from Washington, is that our Middle East partners feel that they want to diversify their relationships. That a lot of us don't buy into the idea that our partners with Saudi Arabia, UAE, or others are leaving the U.S. or moving away from the U.S., but that they are ensuring that they give due credence to a wide range of different partners as part of this kind of approach that sees the world, or at least the Middle East region, as an increasingly multipolar one. And I think there are some there's something to be said for that perspective, and it makes sense in many respects for our friends and colleagues out in the Middle East. And I think you can see that same kind of approach, I guess, that's diversification happening in terms of sovereign wealth, saying, yeah, we've got our traditional investments locations, we've got our traditional assets. That's fine. We're not leaving those. We're not going to pull out our investments. But we're also going to keep an eye out for other opportunities, and we're going to spread some of this investment capital around. Like I said, primarily for economic reasons. But I do think you could probably, if you dig deep enough, you could find some foreign policy. It certainly supports for what I would say is like an emerging foreign policy agenda as well.
Precisely, talking about monetary policy and monetary policy framework, I wonder if you can shed light with us a little bit on the MENA-based sovereign wealth funds as an effective part of an integrated fiscal and monetary policy framework. What's your views on this, precisely taking into account the strategic role of these state-owned investment vehicles in the future of the region?
Yeah. Well, I think the most obvious link is on the fiscal side of things for me. This is the big question, and I alluded to it a little bit earlier. But to what degree are sovereign wealth funds expected to support fiscal needs and emerging fiscal dynamics in these countries? When economic times are good, that's not as much of a concern. When governments, running a surplus or is expected to run a surplus, then sovereign wealth fund can expect to be on the receiving end of those surplus funds. But I mean, the big question is, when we say, if we go back to 2020, a very tough year, 2019 and 2020, these were very difficult years. We saw a growth rate, economies contracting, massive budget deficits. And then the expectations upon the sovereign wealth funds became, that really increased the expectations and the pressure on sovereign wealth funds. And in some cases, that put sovereign wealth fund officials in a tough spot, because if their mandate is to diversify, to diversify their holdings away from the region, as a hedge against what you could say, commodity-based sovereign wealth funds and asset holdings. This is saying, well, no, reverse course in that, and now we need, we need you to invest here, or we need to plug a budget shortfall. In some countries have set up funds, so they have multiple funds. You have a general reserve fund, for example, and then a future generations fund in Kuwait. So Kuwait, for some time, was able to tap into this general reserve fund to support, fiscal needs. But eventually that ran dry, and then they had to start tweaking. The government and parliament had to work together and say, okay, we're not going to we're not going to transfer capital directly from the government to the sovereign wealth fund every year, no matter if we have a surplus or a deficit. They changed that to only during years of surplus. But again, there was this complex negotiation to try to alter the ways in which the Kuwait Investment Authority conducted its business, because the officials there did not, as far as I'm concerned, did not want to do a big, massive U-turn and have to address needs that they would say, this is the government's responsibility to prepare a sound budget and to manage budget shortfalls. I think, it just depends from country to country. But this is the big question. What is the ultimate objective of these sovereign wealth funds? Sometimes it's clear, and the names indicate what the objective should be: a future generations fund. Okay, hands off this fund. We have a general reserve fund, and that specifically for this purpose. But what happens when that one runs dry and you're sitting, and in your Kuwait, you're sitting on several $100 billion of sovereign wealth, and you need, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 billion for the next couple of years. There will be some officials who say, we have access to, we've had access to these financial resources. Why can't we utilize it? Others will say, no, that's not the purpose of this sovereign wealth. So it's a little bit trickier when you get into Saudi Arabia, you look in the Saudi Arabian case study. You don't have multiple different funds, sovereign wealth funds, set up with those different purposes. You have one player, the Public Investment Fund, which is playing so many different roles. I mean, it must just, it has a massive closet for all of the different clothes and the hats that it has to put on, because it's doing, it's really attempting to do many things. It's attempting to be the main driver of economic development within Saudi Arabia. It's committed to supporting and advancing economic interest in the region, in neighboring countries with regional investment offices, and it's making a big splash, across Europe and the U.S. With holdings of kind of major listed U.S. companies. So I mean, its influence and reach is really far-ranging and very wide, and I think like I said, that is okay when times are good, during the good economic times. But when times get tough, a sovereign wealth fund like we see in Saudi Arabia, it's going to find it very challenged to delineate between all of the different pressure that the pressures that it's going to be under, and the different responsibilities and obligations that will be required of it. So I think probably part of the process of the eventual or the continuous professionalization of a fund like the Public Investment Fund is going to be clarifying what its primary objective is, and and doing that very well, rather than trying to do a whole range of different activities. Because that juggling act is going to get harder and harder to do. And if Saudi Arabia finds itself in another situation in a couple of years where the fiscal picture is not so rosy, then there are going to be increasing demands on the sovereign wealth fund to support the Saudi state rather than the other way around. So this is something that I'm sure officials are aware of, and they're thinking quite hard about.
Precisely, if I may, in this matter, some experts have suggested the creation of so-called spending efficiency center I think I will rather calling spending efficiency protocols to allocate commodity revenues between public sector expenditure projects or sovereign wealth funds or development funds. What's your opinion on these spending efficiency protocols, and according to your own research?
Yeah, I think that the policy coordination centers, specifically those that focus on spending policies and allocating government resources, makes sense, especially in a place like Saudi Arabia. And we have seen some examples of the government announcing like a policy coordination center to essentially ensure that all of the different initiatives of Vision 2030 and the different ministries, some of which were newly created, like the Ministry of Investment, that all of these different entities and projects and personnel were, that there was some degree of coordination and collaboration, and that they all were not running in 100 miles, or driving 100 miles per hour in different directions. So I think on the spending side, and with respect to sovereign wealth funds, it does make sense to have, I think it would make sense to have some type of bureaucratic mechanism that does seek to create better coordination and an alignment between these different entities and these different activities. I say that in particular because especially if we stay on the Saudi case just for the sake of ease, there's a lot of uncertainty about where the state involvement ends and the sovereign wealth fund involvement begins. And part and parcel of that is because at times the Saudi government has played up, has really emphasized the central role of the Public Investment Fund. And from a broad objective level, there shouldn't be much debate about whether a sovereign wealth fund is part of the government. It is, a sovereign wealth fund invests the sovereign resources of, a particular country, or sometimes, an emirate. So the relationship to the government should not really be in question. Where I think the more nuanced discussion is what kinds of governance structures are in place, what kinds of investment committees have been created and are used, and their advice is actually followed when making investment decisions. Is there undue political influence from the upper echelons of the political establishment in investment decisions that would override investment committees, that would override kind of due diligence reports or findings or otherwise? I think it's in those kind of, that's the nitty gritty nuanced debate that really has to be had. But if we leave all of that aside, I think that is where the problem is. When people hear news reports about, the government injecting $40 billion, basically sending $40 billion from the central bank to the sovereign wealth fund, transferring assets to the sovereign wealth fund, it starts to get a little fuzzy about, okay, where does the Saudi government's official budget end and where does the sovereign wealth fund portfolio begin? I think it's in the interest of the Saudis and any other Middle East sovereign wealth fund officials to make sure that those lines are as clearly demarcated as possible, because that just reduces uncertainty for investors. That doesn't give investors the sense that they're getting kind of, that they're necessarily getting sovereign, a sovereign guarantee for all of the investments that they might be involved in if they're, involved in a joint venture with a sovereign wealth fund or a company owned by a sovereign wealth fund. There has to be kind of clear guidelines about what exactly is the relationship to the state. And also that will make it easier to determine how spending is allocated across the country. And that's why one of the things, that's what I was talking about before is when a sovereign wealth fund grows, is it growing because it made good investments and is realizing a return on that, on those investments? Or is it just growing in assets because the government decided to transfer assets that otherwise would have been held in another fund, in another government fund, or by the central government or the central bank? If it's just transferring assets or cash from the central bank, that's not organic. That's not creating wealth. That's just, that's moving assets around from one place to the next. Now, you can move assets that are not being utilized and put them into a sovereign wealth fund that that has momentum, that has energy, that has smart people working and can put those assets to better use. So I'm not saying that taking part in those types of activities is not worthwhile, but we have to be very clear about what it is on a broad level and say, okay, this is what it is. Now, what you may decide to do with those assets is a different story, but that's going to take some time to see what you do with it and to measure the return. So that is a very, very long-winded answer to your question. I guess I would say, I would give 2 thumbs up to a spending efficiency center that, that harmonizes those different processes and gives us, some of, observers like myself and analysts like myself and my colleagues, a very clear idea of where these lines are drawn between, between different entities within the government, sovereign wealth funds, central banks, official government budgets. That would be very helpful indeed.
I think this is a sound advice in order to better assess the main interest of sovereign wealth funds, precisely because some developing economies are pursuing their long-term economic development goals, making use of wealth funds as a remedy for sustainable development and needs. What are your views on this?
Yeah, that certainly has been the all of the rage. We heard a lot about sovereign wealth funds, being incorporating ESG frameworks. That a year or so ago, that seemed to be the trend that all of the Middle East sovereign wealth funds, they were jumping on. I think the enthusiasm for ESG frameworks has ebbed a little bit. I would say, just as a as someone from the outside observing these trends, and who I can safely say never completely bought into it. Not that the idea and principle is not good and that those principles should be supported, but by slapping, an ESG sticker, so to speak, on various activities and creating a framework, I thought in many respects seemed a lot more like a box ticking exercise than anything else. I think, I would say, I know this is one of our last questions, so I'm trying to think of a nice pithy way to sum things up, but we have to be honest about what the sovereign wealth funds, what a particular sovereign wealth fund is accomplishing. And these sovereign wealth funds, they're not Superman funds, they're sovereign wealth funds. They can't do everything. And if the idea is to take proceeds that come from hydrocarbon exports that we know at some point there will be a diminishing return on, or it will be diminishing value associated with those hydrocarbon resources and hydrocarbon exports, and you financialize the proceeds that you can get today, and you seek to use that to use those financial resources to create non-oil economies that are more sustainable going forward, that create a more sustainable economy for these countries for not the next decade, but looking ahead 2, 3, 4 decades forward. And you try your best to hire bright people to make investments in a smart, sustainable way that's not directly opposed to climate related considerations and the like. I think that's the best that you can do. But again, like I said, the primary objective of the sovereign wealth funds have to be clarified. And we have to be realistic about, beyond these kind of primary and secondary objectives, how many different goals that, they can actually accomplish. Otherwise, you get into these kind of box ticking, exercises and start saying things that like, all of the investments are going to be kind of net zero investments from the sovereign wealth funds, which primarily derive their proceeds from, hydrocarbon exports. It's kind of in some respects, we start getting into kind of silly territory. So, yeah, I think the sustainable development needs to mean development wherein sovereign wealth fund returns from sovereign wealth fund investments play an increasingly important role in public sector revenues that are not primarily dependent upon, that are not majorly dependent upon oil and gas exports, and that they help support non-oil revenue streams, even if they're indirect in nature. One order away from the hydrocarbon oil and gas sector, and then play an important role in supporting a number of other non-oil industries. I think if the sovereign wealth funds can accomplish that over the next 2 decades and make significant progress there, then that's kind of that's the most important. That would be the most important work that they could be doing towards sustainability, in my view.
I think this has been a wonderful conversation, but I want to address a few open questions before giving back the floor to Mr. Mahmoud Sharif on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Global Economic Future. I want to know, perhaps on your assessment, how would you advise, specifically for the case of the United Arab Emirates and the MENA region, should be a good distribution of the investment, sovereign wealth fund investment portfolio? I think there may be, according to your own experience, different economic or specific technological sectors that perhaps can ensure that cope with the UAE investment priorities. We know that the case of the UAE is quite relevant, considering that perhaps on the top 5 of the sovereign wealth funds, we have the fund from Abu Dhabi, and in the top 10, perhaps you have the fund from Dubai. So based on your research, will you be able, perhaps for the case of the country, to provide advice on how to improve the investment performance of the wealth funds of the country. What do you think will be the future of it? Thank you very much, Dr. Robert.
Well, yeah, I think if I could give
I agree,
really,
it's a big question.
if I could give a really compelling answer to that, gosh, that would probably be very easy to make a lot more money by working with one of these sovereign wealth funds. You know, I think that I guess the one way to answer that question is to look at some of the challenges facing the sovereign wealth funds in the region. And, you know, there is a balance to strike between investing locally and finding lucrative and promising investments internationally, where those investments, you might, generate a return on those investments. It's going to be purely financial. Maybe you build some indirect linkages through the sovereign wealth fund to your economy, but it's not making a direct impact on the domestic economy. Then you've got the kind of second approach, which is believe fully in your local economy and reallocate more investment capital to locally. That's what Saudi Arabia is doing, investing in electric vehicle companies, and then be the primary owner of that company and say you're going to open a warehouse in Saudi Arabia. I think the risk there is that the risk in that the latter type of approach is that investment decisions are made kind of with preconceived notions about what investors would want, and based on a kind of very optimistic assessment of something like Vision 2030, that international investors are going to be as excited about Vision 2030 as the policy planners and the political leadership of a country. And I think we have to also, I think everyone needs, we all need to understand that political leadership in a country that creates a strategic vision and then encourages a sovereign wealth fund to be part of that strategic vision, whether it's Vision 2030 or Vision 2035, 2040, all of the 50-year plans and 50-year charter in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, respectively. It's obvious that the political leadership will be very supportive of these plans. It's obvious, and one would hope that the officials and bureaucrats will be fully behind these efforts, and even to some degree citizens too, because this is the country that they live in. On the flip side of things, the investors who you will hope will come in and will take a 5% share of a company set up by created by a Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund. And then they'll be able to say, okay, well, a foreign investor came in, took 5-10% of this sovereign wealth fund created company. Therefore, our assets are based on this new valuation of this company. I think you just have to remember that the excitement is only going to go so far as that there are there's a real and genuine path to profits in these countries. And I think there are in certain sectors. There's like a lot of excitement about real estate sector, the ITC sector in Saudi Arabia, and the digital economy in the UAE. There's a lot of excitement there, but I think we have to keep that in mind, that in international investors' interest in the region is not driven primarily by by support for country visions and strategies, unless they can use those to help guide investment decisions. But they're not genuinely supportive of it because it's not charity. They're in it to make money, and if they can see a path to profit and they see a profitable partnership with a sovereign wealth fund or a sovereign wealth fund related agency, then sure, they're going to be in. But sometimes I see this disconnect between like the expectations and the support from those within a particular country, and they expect that the investment demand by investors, international investors, to essentially measure up and level up to that. And I think that's one of the big challenges, to make sure that that these sovereign wealth funds have to, especially when they're deploying capital locally and creating companies that are supposed to attract, make these countries attractive investment destinations, they can't lose sight of the most important consideration for international investors, the partners they want to attract. That is there a viable, clear path to profits? That's what they're concerned about, more so than your vision, more so than your 50-year charter, more so than anything else. I mean, they'll be happy to participate in that if they're making money along the way.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robert Mogielnicki. I think this has been quite a fruitful conversation, and definitively it will just stay as a reference for these upcoming discussions. So on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Global Economic Future, I really, really appreciate your time for this conversation, and I would like to give the floor to Mr. Mahmoud Shah to close the session. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think your microphone.
I would like to thank Dr. Robert for participating in our interview with author series. It has offered a high quality content that suit diverse range of audience, policymakers, economic investment and economic experts, investment regulators, and policymakers. It also served as a perfect platform today's event to discuss the current development in sovereign wealth fund industry in the MENA region. Thanks a lot, Dr. Robert. And this was a really insightful and interesting session.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot.